Welcome back to the Super IO Bros podcast, where psychology meets performance and innovation. I'm Carlos, joined by my co-host Yusuf, and today we're diving into the future of entrepreneurial behavior. We're joined by someone who sits at the crossroads of research, product thinking, and startup science, the brilliant and endlessly curious Dane Wagner.
Hey.
Dane is, Dane is an IO psychology practitioner, researcher, serial entrepreneur, mentor, and educator. He's the co founder and chief product officer of Semeta Behavior Science, where he's redefining how founders understand themselves through behavioral science and the funder founder fit. He's also an adjunct professor at FIU, and what sets Dane apart is his curiosity, the kind that pushes him to question assumptions and build new frameworks, like the behavioral taxonomy for entrepreneurship we'll be exploring today. So let's jump in and unpack how behavioral science can transform the way founders lead and grow and build. Now, I said all that, but let's start with a little warm up real quick. So I have a question for you, Dane.
hmm
If you had a time machine but could only use it once to go forward or backward, where would you go and what would you want to see?
Ooh, that's a good question. See, my mind immediately thinks there's so much stuff that's happened in the past that I'm so interested in, right? I've learned so much about history. But then what about the butterfly effect, right? What if I change something? I
Yeah.
think the best thing to do would be to go to the future. I would go to the future, not crazy far, right? I'd go just 100 years forward. I want to understand what we as a society are building towards in one generation's time, understand the impact that we could have. And I guess, there's not to go too deep and philosophical on this, but I guess the question would then be, is the future I see the future that I made or the future that I can make? But
Because
I would choose the future.
it goes into it like, if you do see the future, but then you go back and you change stuff, is it still the future that you saw?
Exactly.
Mhm.
Mm,
Hmm.
it's a very good take. Personally, I would have thought, go back to the past, chill with the Romans for a bit, come back. Yeah.
I don't know. The Romans were a raucous kind of people. Unsure.
I don't know. You kick a rock and then future changes.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying, right? What if me just being there, suddenly it's the Back to the Future effect. I start disintegrating when I come back to the present.
But it also could be the theory of what if you be going back in time is what actually needed to happen for this future to happen.
Ooh, closed timeline theory. I like it. And you're right. What if, right? Which is also, I guess, sort of in the Back to the Future timeline shenanigans, right? End up going back, and it's because of you that so and so is saved, and then this thing happens, and that all just sort of snowballs to the present.
Crazy. You said you got some.
And and then so I know you've had many different phases of your life, kind of, and so I wanted to ask what phase of your life do you think kind of built up your resilience the most?
Oh. Uh, as ridiculous as it is, I'm not gonna say the phases that I did like martial arts or all the like sporty stuff. It's definitely 2020. Like, by far, I would be shocked if that's not the answer for majority of people in the world, honestly. But that was the phase that I no longer was working as a data analyst. I started entering, I was kind of weirdly already planning on it coincidentally. In 2019, I was already taking courses to go into IO. And 2020 was also the year that I started my master's degree in industrial organizational psychology. So, it was the first and only virtual class of the master's program. going into that same year, not only was the pandemic happening, not only was I starting a master's program, but I also went blind for a little bit. And I ended up having severe pressure. I mean, you kind of see it already here. But one of my eyes, for instance, was developing crazy levels of pressure, and I would get these splitting headaches, and I couldn't see anything out of either eye. And there was a period where, throughout the recovery of this and trying to figure out how to solve it and fix the problems, my now wife was reading the textbooks aloud to me and typing out as I dictate to her what needs to be written for the assignments. And she was reading not just the textbooks, which were seriously dry, but also like the actual literature, the journal articles that I needed to go research. I would tell her what are the keywords, and then she'd read me the like the links, and then I'd be like, that one, let's go, like, what's the abstract? All right, cool, now go to the methods. All right, what's going on here? And she'd like she got an honorary degree in IO psychology as far as I'm concerned. But that whole experience, right, from jumping into a new world and trying to succeed in a master's program, the blindness, the pain, the pandemic, that built so much resilience in me that there's nothing can compare.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. And do you feel like it kind of taught you on dealing with uncertainty as well?
For sure, of course. I mean, nothing quite says uncertainty than the world shutting down overnight, it seems, right? And thinking, oh yeah, well, I'm going to go get my master's, and I'm going to have this job that I'm doing right now, and I'll be able to do both things. And then them all going, nope, no, you aren't. And then getting the master's, and suddenly, oh, by the way, now here's a different thing, right? It's not it's not COVID, it's your eyes. Like, working from day to day and recognizing that we cannot predict what
Sorry.
is going to be happening. You know, going from day to day and not being able to predict what is going to be happening, you know, that's definitely dealing with uncertainty.
Yeah. It was definitely a confusing time at that point.
Yeah.
But Carlos.
It's never easy, but you made it out.
I did.
Yeah.
I'm here. I'm alive. And I can see. It's great.
Yeah, exactly. And you're married, you know?
I am.
Better than that, you know?
Thankfully, that was a relatively recent development. So I'm slowly tacking on new and better milestones, right? That's the most recent. And then we'll see what comes after that.
Now, you've also researched this thing called behavioral taxonomy a lot. You know, I did my internship with you, so I learned about it. So for the listeners new to the concept, what is behavioral taxonomy for entrepreneurship, and what is it needed in such why is it needed in such a fast-paced environment as a startup?
So first, let's talk about what a taxonomy is, right? That's a fancy word. And taxonomies are just kind of ways of organizing things, right? It's a way to display a hierarchy of subjects or concepts. So we have taxonomies in all sorts of areas and disciplines. They're very common in most sciences, where you need to organize a lot of different variables. So, you know, you can get as boring as a soil taxonomy in geology, where you are structuring what the different soil types are and the subtypes of those soils, and et cetera, all the way to more complex, like stellar taxonomies, where you're talking about the chemical compounds and makeups and sizes and temperatures, et cetera, that all these stars have in space, right? So when we talk about behavioral taxonomy, It's an organization of the different types of behaviors that exist. Now, you mentioned, and what our specialty has been over the time, and I say our because I work within a company that I got to start, Semeta Behavior Science, and you mentioned, you got to intern there. Awesome experience. We got to push a behavioral taxonomy specifically in the area of entrepreneurship. So what that's saying is, what are the behaviors that entrepreneurs perform in their environments? And we try to organize those in a hierarchy of importance, in tasks, etc. Right? So we try to take that context of an entrepreneurial environment and break it into, what do you do? What does it really mean? Right? Because these taxonomies ultimately are also definitions. And so that involved us going through a huge meta-analysis. It was a complex kind of process because not only was it reading through articles, right? And I just said meta-analysis for those that are listening. That is just a fancy way of saying collecting a bunch of articles into one, right? It's kind of summarizing and trying to find the truth across all these articles and findings. So we got to do that with a bunch of articles, but then we also added in popular press articles. So not only the scientific studies, but also the ones that people were just doing without any real scientific rigor. And then on top of that, we got to also implement some of these theories and take information from that. So it's a multifaceted kind of deep analysis that we got to do to create this behavioral taxonomy. And ultimately, it allows us to point to what a entrepreneur really does, especially in a leadership position, right? Those early stage entrepreneurs who are founders and they're on those founding teams. What do they actually do? What do they need to do? And can we link this, which is what we've done, right? Can we link this taxonomy, this organization of behaviors, to some outcome? And our outcome was success, right? Success being having a successful high-value exit, right? Which is an entrepreneur being able to sell their shares or their position in the company and leave with money. Being able to have a long, sustainable company. So if your company's been around for 10 years or longer, we mark that as a success of sorts, right? Things like that, and there's a couple other ones that we went through, but we marked success as dictated by the entrepreneurs themselves, right? These entrepreneurs, what they were describing as success, we tied it to there. And we tried to link, find those correlations between each behavior and those outcomes.
Yeah, no, I mean, super interesting concept. Like when I think about it, for me, it's just kind of like when I was learning about it, when you guys were teaching me in the internship, I think the easiest way for me to just kind of like relate to it to like real world scenario is like, or like a non-IO brain, or like someone that's researching it is like almost like getting your driver's license. You're doing a driver's test, there's like clear checklist of behaviors you have to do. You have to check the mirrors,
right?
You have to signal when you're going to begin, you have to brake smoothly, you got to do your 3-point turn. It's all about categories for a safe driver, which is, there's no guessing about it. And, entrepreneurship usually doesn't have that clarity. Like you said, it's like, what is a good founder? That's why you did the meta-analysis. You did extensive research on it because it doesn't really have like a clear cut, this is what an entrepreneur is. You got to like make all the facets. And my understanding, you guys created 12 pillars.
Yes, we did. That was sort of the outcome, right? Well, first it was 8. And with further analysis and study into the application of those 8, right? We found that really we were kind of double barreling some of them, and we could be more specific with some of those facets. And so it ended up becoming 12 from those 8.
Now, the 12 pillars, do you have like, I know in some assessments there's like groupings. Do you have like
Mhm.
grouping for them, like a dimension, I would say?
Right.
How many dimensions would you have, you say, for the 12?
So it's interesting that you're describing it that way, because one could argue, right, and this is sort of almost an epistemology kind of question, but the one could argue that each of those pillars themselves are dimensions on their own, because what we really did with those pillars and what those pillars ultimately are collections of traits that people carry through, right? So one of the pillars, for instance, is vision. And vision consists of about 5 different traits. One is, future orientation. Another is systems thinking, stuff like that. These traits make up that pillar. And so in a way, that pillar is functionally a dimension on its own. But what we also discovered is that each of those pillars can further get grouped, and that's where that taxonomy, that hierarchy comes into play, right? Into 4 other categories, right? Which we kind of call cornerstones, right? And that can be cognitive, relational. I forget the other 2 right now off the top of my head. But we have a nice little graphic that kind of goes through these things where we actively try to display that kind of concept. And so we have a multi-dimensional, complex taxonomy that we created, right?
Yeah. See, from 4 to 12, from 12, each individual has probably 5.
Yeah, pretty
So,
much.
no, that's super like amazing. It's great. Like just to think of it, how it came together. How long did it take to get to 12, to the finished product?
Well, the original kind of process started back in, I think, 2017. Actually, it wasn't even like me that initially started. It was my co-founder Nikki and some individuals that helped found the company before Semeta, which was named Blackhawk Behavior Science. Maureen McCusker and Ben Hawks. They were working on this puzzle for a while, right? And it's, as kind of I've hinted at, it's a tough puzzle. And part of that is also due to how people describe entrepreneurship and define it. Like, what's the difference between an entrepreneur and a small business owner, right? Is that the same thing? Is that different? Newsflash, our operationalization would suggest it's different. But the layman and the everyday person and even the scientist may disagree, right? Each person can have their own operationalization of what an entrepreneur really means and what that goes to. So it made going through this data really tricky, because within each of these data sets, we ourselves had to kind of do secondary cleaning and go, wait a minute, they're flagging this kind of person as an entrepreneur. We don't agree. And why don't we agree? We have a theoretical definition that we're trying to target, right? And it kind of comes down to in validation studies, you usually come up with like a criterion, right? And a thing that you're trying to target. But in reality, there's always a deficiency. There's always some sort of issue with that criterion. You're never going to get it perfect. There's always some error, some mess that gets into it. So we have that idea of what an entrepreneur should be, what we're trying to paint, but we also can't force that to be true, right? So we have to let the data tell us. And when we were getting more and more, we eventually were discovering, hey, yeah, we're right, they're wrong. there's enough people that are able to confirm that there's a clear difference between this type of entrepreneur and these other types of entrepreneurs as far as what people are calling entrepreneurship. And so it started in 2017. The 8 came out around 2020, I guess.
And that's kind of when you stepped in, right?
And Blackhawk, exactly. I started working with Blackhawk before I even graduated with my master's degree. And when by basically 2022, we changed it to 12. So it was pretty soon after I kind of got involved. Some of it was, we were starting to ask questions that weren't necessarily being asked, and we had finally gotten confidence in the data that we've collected. Right, it was a very long process. 4 years by that point, by 2021, where we were able to look at that data, look at how people were using it as well. Right, because that's the other thing. A theory, a model is only as good as its usability in the field. And as IO practitioners, right, we are scientific practitioners. That means we need to have the theory good and strong and solid, but we also need it to be usable. And so by going through that, we were saying, okay, yeah, the theory, these 8, it's true, it works. But then when the usability was happening, people are like, wait, but isn't this kind of messy? This doesn't really work because this one is encompassing 2 different concepts. And so when we're going through, we're like, maybe there is. So we fine tune the model and we see, yeah, there is a delineation between this and that. So I think an example of that, for instance, if I remember correctly, we had vision and strategy combined into one, for instance, if I remember correctly. And now it's vision as one and strategy as another, because we found that the predictive traits tied to these behaviors, when you split them into this way, are actually unique, right? They do have different weights. And on top of that, it's beneficial, it's usable to talk about them as 2 separate things, 2 separate entities. So it's kind of a 2-part thing. So 4 years to get to 8, 2 years to get to 12. And now that it's been another 3 years, who knows? Maybe it'll change again. It's proven to be pretty solid so far, which is good.
Yeah, it seems pretty solid from my experience.
Mm-hmm.
What was the moment, right? The moment that you just fell in love, or you just got your buy-in that you wanted to be part of Blackhawk, now Semeta. When did you looked at it and you're like, I want to be part of this, I want to help entrepreneurs? What was that spark for you, and what was the need you felt was needed in the space?
As soon as it was brought to my attention, that was the moment. Yeah, our at the time, who was the program director for our master's program, she had met Nikki at PsyOp, I think the year before or something like that. And she stayed in touch. She sort of kept tabs on her. It wasn't a big deal to each other. But when I came into the program, the question I kept asking every time we learn about a different applicable theory, every time we learn about a different strategy, every time we learn about a different concept, I asked the same exact question each time. And it was just, what about day one? Why are we doing this to fix companies 20, 30 years after they started? Why weren't they already starting to do this day one? Because wouldn't that have been less expensive, easier, faster, all these positive outcomes? So I'd always ask that, and the answer typically is, well, they don't have money to afford an IO practitioner, or we just don't do it historically, right? It's pretty much comes down to those 2 things. So I was already primed to do this on top of my previous entrepreneurial endeavors, right? I had 2 companies before going into it. And by that point, I was already, maybe I was asking that question because I'd been through the growth of companies. And I was like, hey, how do you do this? I struggled, right? It's tough. You don't know a lot of things, and you have to learn it, and you have to make the mistake, and you have to continue going. But if I had somebody with IO knowledge next to me when I was creating my companies, man, it would have been easier. I would have made so many less mistakes, and I would have spent less money than I did, and all this stuff. There's just so much that's beneficial. So the moment our director brought Nikki to my attention, what Blackhawk was doing, I was like, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Come on, let's do it. Let me at it.
What's one advice you think you'd give your past self with what you know now? Or like, I guess, an entrepreneur that's creating a startup, they have a product, it works. What's something you would tell them?
Awesome. It comes down to structuring teams, right? Knowing how to structure teams. The advice would be pay attention to who you're putting on the team. Don't just say, oh, this person has a skill and this person has a skill, they're good. It goes deeper than that. Team dynamics are so much more convoluted and intersecting when it comes to communication and operational flow, procedures. When I perhaps have a very, I mentioned this trait before, so I'm going to go back to it, systems thinking, right? If I'm very systems thinking oriented, right? I look at the big picture and I see all the parts and how they all fit together. I see the system. But you are part thinking, right? You look at the individual section one at a time. I'm going to have problems working with you just based on what I think is better to prioritize versus what you think is better to prioritize. And our immediate thought will not be to explain why we think that's the case, right? Our thought won't be, well, I see the system and I see how all these things fit together. And your thought won't immediately be, yeah, but look at the specific niche. I see the detail and the granular aspects that need to be adjusted. No, because you'll just assume for the most part that the other person thinks that way, right? It's weird to assume someone doesn't think how you think in that regard. You take it for granted. So what we as IOs kind of are super hyper aware of is that every person is in fact an individual, but an organization is trying to collect those individuals into a single whole. So what we bring to the table is being able to identify how to keep the goals of the whole aligned with the needs of the individuals, right? That's what we as IOs are really good at. And that's what our skill set kind of pushes towards. For a startup, think of every kind of problem a company can have. The weight of the consequences of those problems are hundreds upon hundreds of times more severe because you have less number of people. So let's say attrition happens. Someone leaves a startup, that's sometimes half of the workforce if you only have 2 people. It might be a fourth of the entire workforce. They may have been the only people that know how to do a fourth of the company's work, right? Versus you have a company of 10,000 people. Yeah, somebody can leave. That's fine. It's going to suck for the local team, but for the company as a whole, rarely a problem.
Yeah.
Right. And then it's the, there's just these aspects. So not to, spiral into all this stuff, but my advice would be start with the team building. And I would have saved a lot of pain and suffering myself, right? If I knew to look for certain things in individuals beyond just the skills. And for the record, it's not just me that's made those mistakes. It's like every entrepreneur that makes that mistake, right? Because we have a product that works. Now I just need somebody to do finances. Now I just need somebody to do operations. Now I just need someone to do sales, right? You think of the skill and you go, cool, you're really good at this. I'm hiring you for it. But as we know, personality, we got to take the skills and we have to take some sort of social interview kind of process into account. Those are the 3 that lead to the strongest efficacy or value, right? The highest utility for hiring. Same thing applies for entrepreneurs. Look at the personality, look at the skills, look at the social aspects. All 3 of those things are very key.
I see. And, talking about that, I know Semeta has written some articles about founder fit.
Mhm.
So, how does your behavioral taxonomy help founders navigate that fit, team dynamics, as you just talked about, and human capital challenges that often derail the early stages of a startup?
I like that. Founder fit's a really neat area because it's not intuitive to a lot of people. I think it's because when you talk about what does an investor want in the space, right, the funder, and what
Mhm.
does the founder want in the space, you immediately would think it's the same thing, right? You want the company to succeed. You want the company to make money, right? You want the company to grow, flourish, get where they need to go because the investor wants their money back and the founder wants to make more money. Cool. But the sad reality is, while at surface level that is the same thing, any deeper it becomes something different because the investor doesn't care if you're around after they get money, right? Um, if they get 3 times their revenue back, they got their payback. They got their payout. That's it. That's done. They don't have any more stake in your company for the most part. So if you then fall apart and burn to the ground the next day, okay, cool. I got my 3 times. We're out, right? Versus you, on the other hand, if your company falls apart the day after you paid your investors off, that's not good, right? That doesn't end up being beneficial for you. So the
No.
funder founder fit aspect starts with the expectations of what success really means, right? But on top of that, we have to remember that it's a relationship, and all relationships come with communication and trait components, etc. Kind of like the team stuff that I was talking about. So if the funder is coming in and they're used to working at a certain pace with certain expectations, these kind of people, et cetera, they come in with expectations and plans. The founder needs to match that for optimal performance, right? For that to succeed. They need to align effectively with those kind of processes. Otherwise, it's going to be a never ending back and forth headbutting of the founder and funder being like, no, this way, no, that way. I said this, but I said that kind of thing. It's awful. And yeah, they both want money. They both want to succeed, but at what cost, right?
Yeah,
So,
it's kind of like you go to the gym, you get your workout partner, but you might want to get stronger, both of you guys, at the end of the
sure.
day, monetary value. But if one person wants to lift heavy and fast, they just want to keep going, while the other one likes to take it slow, build up their weight over time, you know, there's going to be a lot of disagreeing the pace, the goals. Should you push? Should you rest? Like you were saying, the misalignment. If they both want the company to grow, if they disagree on how to grow, the risk level, the speed, communication style, and decision making, it becomes friction heavy, as you said.
Right. Right. And to extend that metaphor, right, when we look at exercise, for instance, you can be strong for endurance or you can be strong for short bursts, right? You can have your muscle fibers set up so that you can lift a lot of weight once, or you can be set up to lift a little bit of weight for a long period of time, right? And sometimes it's not the same, right? Having the ability to lift a lot of weight once doesn't necessarily mean you can hold a little bit of weight for a long period of time, and vice versa, it doesn't mean. So both people would probably call themselves strong, right? But then we fall into that hole where we realize, whoa, but hold on. What you're training for to be strong isn't what I'm training for to be strong, right? So it's that same concept there. And I think that's a great analogy for it. Yeah.
I do think the sadness of the world, like you said, a lot of investors just want to return.
Mhm.
There sometimes you will find an investor that does believe in the project and they want to keep it growing. They want to go further
Yeah.
with it, and they just believe in the product. They feel like it'll be next level,
Mhm.
which I think happens with these companies that just explode overnight and they just make it big. Like what happened with Apple in the early 2000s, and what happened with Zoom, I think in probably 2018, and then in 2020 is when they just exploded.
Yes, they did. They maybe sadly, I'll say, outbid Skype at the process, which is one of those ironies, and goes to show as well, right? You can have a market basically cornered, right? I don't know if anybody's been around that's going to be listening to this, but for the longest time, you would buy a computer and it would automatically have Skype on it, right? Skype would already have been installed. If you wanted to go video call someone, you would say you were going to Skype them. It didn't matter what you were doing to do the video, you were Skyping. And now, nobody says that. They say, I'm going to Zoom you. Even, yeah, exactly, right? It's this crazy reality, and that's another area where IO psychology stands out. I know we're kind of derailing a little bit here, but it's another area that IO really helps benefit from, because we talk about planning for the future, right? And strategizing for the future, whether it's hiring the right people a month from now, 5 years from now, right? Or preparing someone for changes in their job shape and what their job will look like a month from now, 10 years from now. So we're really key on, hey, let's look at the data, let's look at the trends. What skills are going to need to be learned tomorrow? What skills are learned now? How do we bridge that? But also, what kind of people are going to be needed? What kind of technologies are going to be around? What kind of changes in the market are going to inevitably happen that you need to bring more people in? The scaling, right? If we talk about what happened in 2020 and the technology boom, where everybody went, oh God, it's all virtual. Let's hire every engineer under the sun. So they did that. And then like 2 years later, less than half of those engineers are still working, right? It was a terrible, terrible forecast. And a lot of that was due to just general world uncertainty, sure. But there's a big chunk of it that if more IO people were part of that conversation, they would have probably had a stronger and more secure data-driven decision to be made, where it's to say, hey, maybe don't hire all of them right now, right? Let's start it with waves. Let's recognize that you only need to build infrastructure so much at a time, here, there, etc. But they got super excited, right? And they built a lot of stuff, and then they couldn't sustain it. When we look at Skype, right, I started with that concept where when you're in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, a lot of building for your company, you'll hear the term pivot, right? A lot, which is to say, hey, you have a plan, you were going forward, now the market changed, you have to pivot to a different plan. You have to change. The uncertainty that we talked about at the very beginning of this all, right? And so we as IOs are really good at that forecasting. We as IOs are really good at looking at the data trends, doing the analysis and saying, hey, this is what's realistically going to happen. This is a good planning and scaling process. Startups benefit hugely from that, right? It's one of the big make or break abilities they can have. If they can't forecast, if they cannot prepare and scale at an appropriate pace, then they cannot survive for when changes happen.
Yeah, you have to be flexible and adaptable. I think a startup is probably one of the easiest things to be flexible and adaptable, as it's just starting up. But I mean, a big problem, as you were saying, you got to pivot. Blockbuster, Netflix.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
they didn't pivot, but Netflix made the pivot, and look at it now. They bought up Warner Brothers.
Yeah, isn't that a crazy world? In fact, it's a really good example too, because you had the founder of, or the CEO of Blockbuster, right, blatantly telling people no, even though he was getting the data that said he needed to pivot, right? And that's maybe something else that kind of ties into a little bit of what we've spoken about, which is when I was working like the corporate worlds, I was a little peon, I guess, right? Like I wasn't important or anything like that, but I saw the problems in the companies. I saw the operational difficulties. I saw managerial problems, communication difficulties. I saw all these things that I was struggling with as an employee, and I wanted to fix them. So I'd bring them up, and they'd say, "I don't care. That's who are you to say that?" Right? Or it would be, "How do I even get this information to the right person to make the change?" And that's what inspired me to do the IO stuff. Really, when it comes down to it, it was like, "Hey, I want to be the person that can walk in and say, you should do this. And people should say, you're right. You have expertise in the field. We should listen to you." Even if some of the answers were like very obvious and, I didn't need a degree to figure out that answer, at least now I have the credentials to back up my statements.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of why I kind of went into IO. It's because not exactly corporate, but more of the retail side. Like I'd notice a lot of like negativity in the environment and a lot of mismanagement. And obviously, as a retail employee, like a part-time employee, I can't really say anything against
Mhm.
it. Like they don't really care. So that's kind of what drove me towards IO when I did more research into it. It's kind of
Mhm.
interesting.
Right.
And yeah, and also since we were talking about technology, I kind of
Mhm.
wanted to see what you thought about AI like helping out with this kind of behavioral work without messing anything up. If you think there's a place for it.
That is the hot topic question that I am. It feels like I'm perpetually following on. And so, what it comes down to, right, is that most AI models are non-deterministic models. What does that mean? That means that there's not a set way that they get the answer every time. It's a different way each time, and they're black box models. This means that we give it parameters, right? We're talking 2,000 plus, no, way more right now. Sorry, that was a ridiculously underballed number. I think I'm not going to say a number right now. People can go research that, but right now, whatever it is an insane number of parameters for the record of the model. And these parameters are just ways of us saying, "Hey, LLM, when answering a question, follow these rules." And the rules are in the thousands upon thousands of rules that it's following. These parameters will only control for so much, right? It doesn't have a high replication rate. So when we're doing behavioral research using AI, it is tricky. It's good for initial probes, right? It's good for gathering active data, and it is good at creating scripts, right? So if I don't know if people are super familiar with that are listening, but a lot of the analyses that we do are going to be in programs, right? We're not like manually typing in, "Oh, let me uh, calculate the variance piece by piece by piece." No, we're going to tell a program like R to go get the variance for this data set. And that's it, right? And we don't have to really do anything else other than tell it to do that, and it'll spit it back out. We can mess with some parameters in there, right? We can tell it to take the variance within this bound and do all this and change these aspects. But for the most part, you can just say, go find the variance, enter, and it'll do it. LLMs are great at creating those scripts. You can tell it the problem you want to solve, how you want to solve that problem, and it'll give you what to feed into R or Python or whatever. When it does it itself, you will oftentimes find that it takes shortcuts and makes up part of those processes that aren't real. So you'll say, "Hey, go find the variance," and it'll just come up with a number that it ballparks and looks at the data and it's like, "Yeah, that should be roughly the variance," but it never did the math. It never actually got the variance. And so you're doing this behavioral taxonomy, and thematic research is a lot of what we have to do, right? We have to take the qualitative research and pull these words and find the themes. It doesn't have a structured way of doing that. And as science, we need structured ways of doing that. So long story short, you can take an open source version of the model, limit the amount of liberties it takes to go do things, pretty much break it down into a very specific and highly limited model, and you'll get a better chance of doing things correctly. But as it currently stands, the vast majority of models, especially the big box models, we're talking, Claude, Meta, OpenAI, Anthropic, Meta, and OpenAI, they're still non-deterministic. They're still very generalized. So when you go to just grab those and do this,
Yeah.
you can't always trust the outcome.
Yeah, some people just think it's like magic, like it'll just do everything for them, but you
It's
need to build it to do with that.
Exactly.
the cyborg theory.
Cyborg
We
theory.
did a podcast. I think it's episode 2. It's called this. We did it on AI, and we read some literature that they said the cyborg theory, and then like the centaur. So like the cyborg is basically you put in anything you need in AI, and it does everything. Now
Mhm.
the centaur is more like you pick and choose. Like you were saying, you might need it to gather some info for you, but you still check it. You don't believe everything that it says, and
Yes.
you kind of just use it to your advantage. But everything you do basically is you, you know.
Mhm.
So it's like you said, use it for the parameters you want, but you don't trust it 100%.
Yeah, that's the future, by the way, for IO psychology, as far as I'm concerned, right? AI is going to be pervasive, constantly used, and as currently it's happening, is going to be replacing members of teams in its entirety, right? You will be a team of Carlos, Yusuf, and Claude, right? You three will be a team, and you'll work together and you'll converse like a normal team and you'll get things done like a normal team. But that also means that a lot of the dynamics and expectations are weird, right? Norms are weird. How you talk with Claude is going to be different than how you talk with each other. And now, what does that mean for not just the culture, right? But also, what does that mean for the more specific nitty gritty aspects that correlate with performance and production and attrition and all these other like areas that we are very obsessed with when it comes to workplaces? It's very complex. It's something that's going to need a lot of studying, a lot of dynamics. We as IOs, that's our expertise. So now our focus is going to be, how do you maintain the centaur process, right? Keep the human-centric modeling going while also incorporating it in a very full and reliable way. Who knows?
It's also, I think, some companies might even, there's some that provide you autonomy, but some companies I know that they monitor your screens and stuff like that. So
Sure.
you could have a company that goes ahead and starts monitoring your chats with your AI companion.
Yeah.
So it's just like, how much freedom do you have to kind of work something out? If they're monitoring you, you might just not want to be like as creative as you want to be, Who knows?
That's already happening too, for the record, with different communication platforms like Slack or with online like Teams and stuff like that. A lot of larger companies are already collecting that data, right? They're already looking at that communication process, and it's because it's important, right? But do they have the right intentions behind it? Are they doing it in a clean and ethical way? That's another conversation entirely, right?
I think yet to be determined. I think it's a little too early.
Yeah, exactly. Yet to be determined.
You see, if you got anything else about this?
No, not right now.
All right. Well, we're gonna move into the next question. So let's dive into FIU teaching. What motivated you to become an educator, and how was that experience complemented or contrasted with your work as a CPO at Semeta?
I think ever since I was a wee lad, I was obsessed with learning, right? I was a voracious reader. I read anything, including super boring information like encyclopedias, and I took everything I could from it. And this, unfortunately, was to the detriment of anybody and everybody around me, because not only did I take it in, I felt like I really needed to share it with everybody. I was constantly sharing facts, all like useful facts and dumb facts, right? Somebody's like using a fan. I'm like, hey, there's a switch on that fan that allows you to turn it the other way around. You do that as an extractor instead of a circulatory. I was like, all right, you 7-year-old kid, shut up. Like, stop telling me what to do here. But then they would do it and they'd be like, wow, I learned something new today, right? So that is why I became an educator, right? Ultimately, it's because I got this information and I need to share it. I have to. It's going to come out whether I want it to or not. So it might as well come out in a beneficial way that helps our posterity, right? I had this, I used to teach maths and sciences for middle and secondary school, right? Middle school and high school. Yeah. And one of the things that I used to always say then was our prosperity is in our posterity, right? By having a better future generation, we're going to be better right now. Right? So the truth is, it was inevitable. It was going to happen. And that bleeds directly into my role as like a CPO, because sharing information from a startup perspective is really key, right? Our job as Semeta, one of the biggest components of our job is education. We have to teach founders and funders and coaches and everybody and their mother, it feels sometimes, why this kind of stuff matters and why systems and models that they currently use aren't optimal, and how little changes could actually result in large effect sizes. So education is a big component. On top of that, being a teacher is functionally being a leader, right? You're in charge of a group of individuals. You're trying to guide them through processes. You're trying to get them towards a specific goal. Being in a leadership position blends perfectly with that, right? Being a CPO, anybody who comes underneath is the same concept. It's herding them together. It's trying to get them towards a unified goal. It's trying to help them grow and improve in a way that makes that goal more possible. So it all kind of comes together very, very cleanly, in my opinion.
That's well said. And thank you so much, Dane. That wraps up today's episode of the Super IO Bros podcast. Big thanks to Dane Wagner for sharing his insights and the innovative work he's doing in entrepreneurial behavior science. If you enjoyed this conversation, share the episode and connect with us online. Our next episode will be kicking off in the new year, so stay tuned. This is Yusuf and Carlos signing off. Stay curious and keep applying the science.
Thanks, guys.